Hello, Year 12. This is Mr. Ferreira, and I'm going to be talking you through the next part of the course, which is minority influence. Now, what is important for us to take note of is up until this point, we've been talking about majority influence when it comes to conformity, and certainly in terms of obedience, it's not about minority or majority because it's about obeying an instruction. But we don't always find that social influence comes from the majority. Is it possible for us to potentially see how a small group could influence the majority? Now, we split this into an individual section on minority influence, and then we'll do a separate section on social change. But let's look at a definition for minority influence. So it simply says that minority influence is a form of social influence. So once again, there's a recurring theme that I'm kind of teaching about social influence, but it says where the member of the majority group change their beliefs as a result of the exposure to a persuasive minority. So the difference really in terms of the change here is that the change is going to be deeper. So previously we looked at things like compliance and even identification, where ultimately the conformity may stop after a short period of time. But of course, it says here a persuasive minority. So in other words, we can understand that change doesn't happen unless we're persuaded. And many people talk about some element of being converted in this particular context. And I suppose the reality of it is when you are in the majority, you don't have to change because everyone else is doing what you are doing. Possibly why something like patriarchism has had such a strong hold on society is because the people in power, the majority of people in power, haven't felt that they needed to adjust inequalities in kind of male-female kind of gender inequalities, and that's why you don't have to do anything about it. So let's look at what the specification asks us to do. Okay, so first of all, it's quite straightforward. They say minority influence, okay, and so they leave it kind of open, including reference to consistency, commitment, and flexibility. So that is what I'm going to have a look at. How does minority influence relate to consistency, commitment, and flexibility? So first of all, consistency. And I've called these factors that influence how effective the minority is, okay? Consistency. So it simply says that a minority are more influential if they express their arguments consistently. So let's look at a situation where there is a minority. So if I have a minority view that you should change your behavior in some particular way, and I am not giving the same message, okay? Now, I don't want to be too controversial, but there are a group of people who feel that masks are an infringement on people's social rights. So it is a minority group because most people have accepted that wearing a mask may help you. So the problem with them influencing me as to whether I wear a mask is that their arguments aren't consistent, because some of them argue that the virus doesn't exist. Some of them argue that masks kind of help spread the virus. Others argue something completely different. So therefore, if I'm the majority, I'm less likely to want to listen to them because which of their arguments is correct? So we have two types of consistency. We have synchronous consistency, okay, or diachromatic consistency. So the first one is relating to an agreement between groups. Okay, that's the example I've used, that a group of people who are trying to get you to potentially not wear masks don't seem to agree. The second one is consistency over time. Now, this one's actually a lot easier to think about it. So, for example, in places like South Africa where there was apartheid, there was always a minority group who were arguing that it is wrong. And, after 40 years of arguing the same thing, people kind of started to pay attention. And of course, that has resulted in the government changing. So please remember those two terms. Now, why does consistency help you? Well, it says here that you're taken more seriously. And if somebody takes you more seriously, they will rethink their position. So, for example, if I think, well, actually, there is something to think about, then I will perhaps challenge my own views. Okay, especially if you're expressing the same message, I'm likely to believe you. So that one seems fairly straightforward, consistency. The second one is commitment. And what is really important to commitment is risk. A basic misunderstanding of commitment of many students is that commitment is about doing the same thing for a long time. So in other words, talking about consistency, the diachromatic consistency. But no, I want you to change that view. Commitment is about risk. So in other words, I am showing commitment towards something. Give you an example, maybe within school. If I have a minority view that a student is actually innocent of a particular thing that they've been accused of, okay? If I'm prepared to say, put my job on the line, if I go to the head teacher and say, look, if we punish this person, if we permanently exclude them, I'm going to leave as well. That is showing that I'm committed to the belief that they are innocent. There's a risk there. I may actually have to leave my job. So therefore, that is obviously going to be important in terms of a minority group. If the minority group risk themselves, it shows that they actually are committed to the cause. And therefore, once again, I'm likely to pay more attention to them. The last one is flexibility. Now, you might think, well, hang on, I've just told you that you need to be committed and you need to be consistent, but surely the opposite of being consistent is being flexible. Well, this is the case. I've said that you do need to be consistent. However, part of human nature is that we don't like to be pushed into the corner. So it says here that if I, for example, repeat the same argument again and again, I might come across as being rigid, or if I do the same action again and again, I might be inflexible. And of course, instead of a person then listening to my views, they may actually start thinking, well, hang on, I'm not being given a choice here. So it would be viewed negatively. But it says here, on the other hand, you also need to kind of consider that if I'm too flexible, then I'm not being consistent. So this one is a slightly different one because it is about a nuance, an expectation that you're meant to have some degree of consistency. And we see here Magni basically says that the minority needs to have some degree of flexibility rather than none at all. So in other words, it's about being flexible about the right things. So for example, gay rights activists have campaigned for years and years that gay marriage should be allowed and seen as being exactly the same as any other form of marriage. Now, of course, this is what is the case at the moment in the UK. However, before this law was changed, the government proposed something called a civil partnership. And there are still civil partnerships now. In fact, heterosexual couples have taken the government to court, kind of arguing that they should be allowed to have a civil partnership, which is very similar to marriage, but it doesn't involve kind of the marriage ceremony, and there's no kind of mention of God in the service. Now, you could say that if the gay rights activists were arguing that no, what they want is marriage and nothing else is acceptable, then they would have been seen as being inflexible and therefore not taken seriously. However, of course, they saw this as a win and they accepted civil partnerships. And it actually took a very short time between them campaigning for marriage and getting civil partnerships to actually the legalization of gay marriage. And so it could be that when people saw civil partnerships as being kind of acceptable and fine and happy with it, that the majority were able to change their views. And now it's become a majority view that gay marriage is acceptable. Now, the second part of this, and this is something which I debated as to whether I leave out of this particular section, is because it's not mentioned specifically in the specification. However, it does ask us to teach you about minority influence. And so what I have is research. Now, there's two pieces of research I want to show you. One is by Moscovici and one is by Clark. Now, I genuinely want you to consider not doing both of them, just consider one of them. Also, I do hope that you can see that if this is research into minority influence, it is genuinely going to be considered as research support, so therefore could be evaluation. Now, the reason I am mentioning Moscovici is mainly because it has popped up back in the textbooks and people have been using it. And that's why I'm going to teach you about it. However, I don't have much faith in the Moscovici research, and therefore that's why I've presented you with the Clark as well. So it is simply a choice for you. Now, Moscovici does research that's kind of very similar to ASH. It says here, a visual perception task. Okay, now this is just a simple diagram, sort of presenting kind of what Moscovici was doing. So you had two Confederates that are the minority and all the subjects. And they were presented with color cards, and like the ASH experiment, had to then call out loud what they felt was the color of the card. Now, the cards were all blue. Now, of course, there are at least, I mean, if there's 50 shades of gray, there certainly must be 100 or so shades of blue. I don't know where I get the number from, but certainly I'm going with that. And so they will say blue, 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 but the Confederates will consistently say green. Okay, and they're a minority group. Now, this is just a bit about it. They've showed 36 slides, varying shades. The two participants were Confederates in the experiment, just kind of what I've said. They have 24 critical trials, and this is kind of how we need to kind of just remember the study. So this is why Moscovici is considered as being research into minority influence that kind of helps us. So we see here it says participants on the consistent condition conformed to the minority 8.4% of the time of the critical trials. Now this was compared with 1.3% in the inconsistent condition. So one condition they always said it was green, and another condition they occasionally said it was green, occasionally said it wasn't. Okay, and we see that there is still at least some level of conformity. So I know the numbers are incredibly low, but once again, there's no reason why they shouldn't, or they should change their views. And so we do say these findings show that if you are consistent, you do influence members of the majority. So there we go. That's Moscovici. And I'm sure you can find many kind of concerns with it. My main one is that the numbers are very low, and also, you know, color is quite a personal thing. Some people perhaps, you know, can't see color as clearly as others. Some people don't care about color. And so therefore, I'm not sure in that artificial situation, it will kind of make much of a difference. So that's why I turned to Clark. And I turned to Clark for two good reasons. One of them is the film, 12 Angry Men. Okay, and here's a picture of it. And what you find in 12 Angry Men, it's a court case, and it's actually a film that I sometimes have watched within school. And you find one juror, I think he's juror number 4, he refuses to convict the person who's been accused of murder. Not because he believes he's innocent, but he consistently says that we need to re-examine the evidence. Okay, and of course you do get some of the people getting incredibly frustrated. Now let's just watch a quick clip on this. Okay, I can't because I'm at school. I'm going to go back to the notebook. And what you can, if you just type in 12 Angry Men into YouTube, you can watch clips about it. Now, it actually is a really interesting film because it's all about argument, all about what they say to each other. And we see that there's also one of the participants who's an authoritarian personality. And certainly when you come back to school, I'll try and show you that clip. And what happens is ultimately by re-examining the evidence and kind of exploring different ideas and being consistent over time, you see literally how one man changes people's opinions. You also then see how at one point then they become the majority, and then of course other things happen with that, and I'll make reference to that when we do social change. But this is why I want to use this particular study, because the film wasn't the most important thing, is that these participants who had never seen the film before had to watch the particular film. And then they were asked questions about the film. And they said here, the participants felt that Clark, or the person, the juror, was, because of the consistency of the argument, were able to convince other people. And so, in other words, changing the majority was about consistency of argument there. So rather than it being about kind of these artificial color situations, it's kind of a more realistic situation. I know it's still a film that's scripted, but it does kind of show us that maybe there is research that kind of understands consistency. So there we have it. Those are 2 studies that we can use to back it up. So that's why my first evaluation point does literally point to Moscovici. Now you could just substitute that for Clark if you want. In this particular case, it's a part of my peak paragraph because it's saying it's research support using the evidence of Moscovici, but then I add another piece of evidence here. So there's something called a meta-analysis, and I will do meta-analysis in the research methods with you. But the short of it is that it is a study of studies. So in other words, they found 97 studies on minority influence, and they analyzed the data and analyzed the results, not the data, the publications of it. And basically, once again, they talk about consistency being influential. So in other words, regardless of whether you kind of agree with the Moscovici research, there's quite a lot kind of indicating to us that being consistent does influence the majority. We also find that flexibility is an interesting situation. Now, the examples of commitment perhaps will come from social change, where we find that things like the suffragette movement and things like that, where people did risk their lives, potentially influence the outcome. But I'm not going to use that now. I'm going to use that during social change. So let's look at flexibility here. So it says here, it says argues that consistency can be interpreted negatively. That's kind of what I've said previously. So he does some research with this, and he said that some degree of shift towards the majority was actually have an influence. Now, of course, I've mentioned something like the civil partnerships, but here they are examining kind of a court case, and the group members were basically had to discuss how much compensation that they had to give to somebody who had been in an accident. Okay, and in one situation, the Confederates basically needed to offer a different point of view. And what they do is that when they show some degree of flexibility, they get their view put across. It's kind of like in negotiation. He also then discovered that the flexibility the flexibility needs to come late in the negotiation. So it's one of these situations where you would expect that is um, the best thing is for us to think about flexibility in terms of something like a negotiation. If the majority have a kind of a strong position, the person in the minority position needs to kind of think about it. Otherwise, of course, it says they appear to be caving in. So I know you might not think that's brilliant kind of research, but I do believe that it's important for us to have a look at kind of this whole idea that there is kind of evidence out there to support it. Now, the last kind of evaluation point is talking about a limitation. And I suppose we've kind of all seen this, that all the piece of research that we have basically don't actually tell us much about minority influence in the real world, because there's a couple of things that they get wrong. So it says, so firstly, the studies can easily distinguish between the minority and the majority. Okay, and I suppose this is where real world politics often is complex. So, for example, in the first Trump election, the polls were saying quite clearly that Trump wasn't going to win. And that is because the people who potentially Trump supporters weren't actually admitting it, or some of them weren't actually admitting it. And so it's very easy to kind of see where or it's very difficult to see exactly where the numbers are. But in an experiment, I can say, okay, those people in the minority, these people are the majority. Especially if you consider other things. So in the real world, there are things like the issue of power. You know, for example, if I am exerting my political power and comfortable, certainly I'd say a lot of white South Africans were comfortable with the situation that they had in South Africa. And so why would they want to change things? And so they might talk to somebody and say, oh, yeah, I support you and I want to change the country. But when it comes to the crunch, they might not do. So I suppose this is not giving too much evidence. It's kind of giving more of an example, basically saying in the real world, we need to consider that there's some real issues here. And I suppose the second thing is that in the real world, there's often serious outcomes. I can remember doing kind of some work with HIV infection rates in South Africa. And for many of the women, if they expressed any concern to their husbands about using a condom, their husbands would beat them because of a power struggle and kind of this arrogance about kind of who can say what and things like that. And so, of course, we see something like that. So, for example, often even politically, in some countries, that women don't. They might have the vote, but they've got to vote what their husband tells them. And all of these inequalities exist in the real world. And so we need to kind of be appreciative that minority kind of views don't often have power. So what we can say then about these particular studies of Moscovici, even Clark and stuff like that, is that they all lack external validity because the participants just literally weren't doing anything that was of any real value because people's perceptions of color, as I said, who cares about that? So it's unfortunate that it says here it cannot tell us about how minority influence works in the real social situations. So I can see the effects of minority influence, but I can't actually say how it's going to happen in the real world. Now, there we have it. We have kind of the notes. I know that this is a longer video than usual because it's going to cover a number of lessons, but just to finish with, I'm just going to look at a couple of questions. So this is a question that came up before we started the exams, and I'm just going to go through this quite quickly. It says, use your knowledge of conformity and minority influence to explain the factors that will determine how successful a small group of students will be. Okay. So the reason it says your knowledge of conformity and minority influence is because I do feel that we need to consider that when the minority becomes bigger and bigger, it then turns to become the majority. So there is a real shift in how people then become about, remember the video I showed you about how to start a movement? It gets to the point where it's not about minority influence and all about majority influence. And so that was just kind of hinting towards that. And then as we read the story, what we find is we're getting a group of students who want to go paper free. So the way that I would perhaps recommend this is say, okay, so let's break this down into conformity and minority influence. And in terms of minority influence, we need to look at consistency, commitment, and flexibility. So we've got to say, well, how can a group of people consider that for paper free? So consistency, so repeated assemblies, repeated meetings with the people, and kind of basically saying the message again and again. They also then need to be consistent amongst themselves. Make sure it's really clear to each other what do they mean by paper free. So for example, we might not be able to sit exams as a paper free school because a lot of the exams are on paper. So does paper free means that we don't send letters home to parents? So trying to find some kind of consistency there. The commitment, I suggest in this particular case, maybe the occasional sit down, maybe some of the people will refuse to hand in paperwork and only do electronic copies. That could get them in trouble. They could be seen as not finishing homework or not completing tasks and stuff like that, and they could get detentions and punishments. Anything like that, or they could sit in, school reception, refuse to leave until something changes. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but that would show commitment once again. And then obviously flexibility. So maybe it's along the lines of, okay, so we will have paper-free Fridays, or we will have, in other words, say, okay, we might not be able to do this from next week, but actually maybe we will start on a small scale. Or they could say, okay, so in terms of all letters sent home, they will be paper free, they'll be electronically sent, or something along those lines. So they're kind of showing flexibility in terms of what they do. So I know it's easy for me to think of these examples because I have looked at this question before, but sometimes it's just kind of looking at and saying, okay, so that's what minority influence is. Can I find those three things? In terms of conformity, of course, we got to think about things like maybe identification, things like that. So maybe getting some popular teachers or popular people to promote paper free so that people identify them, say, I want to be like that. Or maybe we could look at something like getting so once it putting posters up, so once it becomes popular opinion that everyone else kind of wants to follow it as well, you can kind of knock yourself out in terms of that. What they were looking for is that this was a level marked descriptor. So it says knowledge of conformity and minority influence research is clear and generally well detailed. Okay, so in other words, it says use your knowledge. So in other words, explain commitment, consistency, and flexibility. Don't just talk about the example, explain how it will actually work. And we see in the mark scheme, of course, they do talk about consistency, commitment, and flexibility as well. Just very briefly, then we have from an actual exam, they said name 3 behaviors that enable a minority to influence. Love it when they say name, because that's just literally consistency, commitment, flexibility, 3 marks, done. But then it says Marcus wants to persuade his group of friends to go traveling in the summer, but the rest of the group would like to go to the beach holiday. Briefly suggest how. Once again, it's this how question, and people often miss this in the exam. So in other words, it's asking what will Marcus do to be consistent and show commitment and show flexibility. And a lot of people got this wrong in terms of kind of the actions. And so in terms of commitment, the commitment is risk. So therefore he can go and buy his ticket and potentially kind of say to each other, look, I've bought my ticket. If you don't do this for me, I'm going on this holiday anyway. Flexibility, a lot of people just recognize things like he can talk to them about kind of different options where they can go traveling and go to the beach. So, going to countries that do have both of those kind of interests there. And then a consistency. So every time he sees them, or every time they talk about what they want to do after in the summer and things like that, he needs to bring it up once again, consistently bring it up, and also be quite clear about what he wants to do. So therefore, make sure that they know exactly what he means by. It says his group to go traveling. So what does he mean by traveling? And the mark scheme does literally kind of talk about those three things. So therefore, as you can see, minority influence actually should be a lot more straightforward for you now. You've done a bit of psychology, you understand social influence, you understand the idea of looking at the specification, and we should easily be able to do this. I thank you for listening to this. I know it's been a lot longer, but it is going to cover a number of lessons, and I'd like to say I wish you well. Okay, goodbye.